IDC Radio, 106.2 FM. IDC Radio, in collaboration with Kol Israel.
IDC International Radio, 106.2 FM, from Israel to the world.
Counter-Terrorism Today.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Counter-Terrorism Today. Thank you for watching us on Facebook Live. Thank you for listening to us on all the different platforms that we are on. This is Counter-Terrorism Today. I'm Itai Hanman, and in studio with me is a very special guest today. She's here giving a lecture series at the IDC for the master's students. She'll be joining us later in September as well for the World Summit Conference. With us here in studio is Miss Michele Coninsx. She is the Executive Director of the Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, CTED, at the UN, at the Assistant Secretary General level. Miss Coninsx, how are you doing today?
Good afternoon. I'm doing fine. Thank you very much.
Very much appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us here in the studio at IDC Radio. And this program is very interesting as we combine the knowledge that we gain here at the ICT, at the International Counterterrorism Institute, and try to bring it forward to our public and try to inform and make people aware of the subject matter. And no better person to have speak to us about this is yourself. And we'll get right into it. You are here this week giving a lecture series at the IDC. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that lecture series is about. What do the master's students, can they expect from the course, and what do you think the outcomes are?
Well, it's indeed a course of 3 days at master level in order to make this group of very intelligent students aware of the work, the added value of United Nations in combating terrorism, in countering violent extremism. And I hope that I will create awareness. So we had interactive discussions. I hope that at least when they go back home, they know a little bit more about the work of the United Nations, the work of CTED, the added value and the difference we can make.
No, that's excellent. I hope that the students gain as much as I did in the few minutes that I was able to sit in your course. Extremely insightful and very interesting stuff. Maybe you can explain to us a little bit what CTED is exactly. For those that don't know, it is the Counterterrorism Executive Directorate of the UN. But other than that, not many people have too much of a broad knowledge on this specific subsection of the UN. Maybe you can explain to us a little bit.
Well, that's exactly the reason why I had to come to Israel. CTED is an entity, is an organization working directly for the Security Council, for the subsidiary body of the Security Council called the CTC, the Counterterrorism Committee. You know that Security Council is the organ that is dealing with all threats posed to international security and peace. And our piece of the work is to follow the policy guidance of the CTC in order to verify what is happening in the 193 member states in relation to the Security Council resolutions related to terrorism and violent extremism, in order to verify what is the state of play of the implementation in the member states, to get a hold on the latest trends in counterterrorism and in violent extremism, and to render expertise in CT and violent extremism countering around the world, around the clock. Wherever needed and whenever needed. We are not alone in this field. There are also important organizations in the General Assembly, and our role is to work hand in hand as one UN in countering terrorism and violent extremism.
And you mentioned the CTC, the Committee for Counterterrorism, and they set policy, and CTED sort of implements such policy. How does CTED go about implementing this policy?
Well, main role is threefold. We do assessments counterterrorism assessments in the 193 countries on behalf of the CTC, and there we follow all the Security Council resolutions and the 90 legal instruments and conventions on terrorism in all the countries. Second role is for the CTC have a constant radar on the latest trends, developments, lessons learned in counterterrorism and countering of violent extremism, and keep the CTC informed and organizing for and on behalf of the CTC with the CTC events, open, close events on those new trends, on those new developments, which are really keeping us awake during night. And thirdly, to also discuss the expertise, be it in specific areas like the gathering of digital evidence, battlefield evidence, just to mention a few of them.
So what would you, in your opinion, be the number one role that CTED plays in the global fight against terrorism?
Well, I would say in 3 words: assessment, assessment, assessment. And the assessments are really meant to give, in fact, sort of a free audit to the member states, going to the member states, having a dialogue with the member states at technical, operational level, but also at political level, and seeing in what extent they are a very strong element of the CT chain or a very weak element of the CT chain. And in that regard, we really assess, have a dialogue on all security CT measures, going from border control to legal frameworks to counterterrorism strategies, strategies in countering violent extremism, in seeing how they are advanced in counter-narrative, how they are countering the massive misuse, abuse of ICT for terrorist purposes, in what extent they are tackling financing of terrorism, just to mention a few of them. So we have a whole methodology, and we use exactly the same methodology in the 193 countries. In Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, wherever we go, we use the same methodology in order to ensure full neutrality, objectivity, and independence.
And it's very interesting. Dr. Boaz Ganor has always mentioned, at least from when I was a student and continue to work here, that it takes a network to beat a network. And your organization is a very unique position, being a part of the UN and in contact with 193 member states, i.e. an ability to build a community and build a network. In your opinion, how important is it for global cooperation in the fight against counterterrorism, or in the fight against terrorism, excuse me?
It's just essential. We cannot live on our island and think that only at local or at national level or even at regional level we can manage to keep pace with the current global extent and character of terrorism and violent extremism. So yes, you need indeed a network to beat another network, but this is of a very special nature. We have never seen what we see nowadays. Being confronted with foreign terrorist fighters returning and relocating, which is posing a problem in nearly all the countries in the globe, as we have seen that foreign terrorist fighters have left at least 120 countries. The massive use of ICT, new technologies, social media for terrorist purposes, and that is, as the word says, an international burden, and the financing of terrorism is also spreading with a pace never seen before, because financing is also the funding is also making use of ICT, just to mention one example. What we absolutely favor is having this dialogue with all the member states in the world. And that gives us, first of all, an insight in the globe, in what's happening in the world. But we also are strong believers in networks, and hence in 2015 we have established a global research network. In my unit of 50 persons, I have a political and analytical research unit, which is liaising every single day with members of the GRN, and IDC is a member of the GRN. We have around 100 research centers, think tanks, academic centers linking up with us, and that is absolutely meant to couple our findings, our outcomes of the assessments to the research work. If we see that, for instance, the role of women is not highlighted in all the countries, the role of women in foreign terrorist fighters, for instance, women can be victims, but also can have active roles as foreign terrorist fighters, facilitators, can be supporters, can be insiders, can be recruiters, or can also be active agents of change and have an active role in the prevention of terrorism. So yes, if you look at a returning woman, what is the assessment you make of this woman? Can we absolutely say that this woman was only a victimized victim? Had this woman a double role? Did she go to the conflict zones with really terrorist intent and was then becoming a victim of sexual abuse and had double roles? Is she somebody who, when returning back, can have an absolute role in a design of counterterrorism strategies and countering violent extremist strategies? So that is part of the reality. If we do not have a society where the woman can play that role in the design of strategies, because the role of women in that society is not really considered at all as a possibility, then we have to make a point out of it. So this is where we have, for instance, very recently made a study on the gender dimensions of the returning foreign terrorist fighters. Since April, it's on our website, but that was the fruit exactly of a good cooperation between our analysts and the research centers.
Oh, it's very interesting to hear about the links between your center and all the other institutions that you made mention of. And you did bring up foreign terrorist fighters, and it brings me to my next question is, how do you think that countries should be able to deal with these foreign fighters that are returning to their home countries now, from multiple perspectives, from a legal perspective, a human rights perspective, but as well from a threat assessment level? How do you think countries should go about dealing with that?
Well, returning and relocating, transiting foreign terrorist fighters are a huge concern, a global concern. And there is one thing that is absolutely true. It's a global problem, but it asks for a tailor-made approach, and there is no one-size-fits-all. That means that every single member state can be confronted with a returnee or a relocator on its territory, and that means that a lot of things have to be taken care of. We have a Security Council resolution 2396 since 27, and that is really requiring and asking, calling upon the member states to do a lot of things, such as having a legal framework which is copying in the I would say criminal offense on foreign terrorist fighters. We have a definition of foreign terrorist fighters. That's a legal aspect, but also to take care of the human rights aspect, as the Security Council resolution is asking all the member states, requiring all the member states to take actions at the borders with the newest tools and technologies, like advanced passenger information, like passenger names record, like biometrics, like watch lists and databases. You can imagine that if you have information on women, on children, on men returning from the conflict zones, this is a matter of concern in relation to human rights and data protection. So how do you have the right legal frames, the capacity, the organization, and all the technicity that goes with that need, which is, again, a requirement for the 193 countries. And how do you assess the risk of a returning? What is the condition to be met to become a high risk or a medium risk or a low risk returnee? And of course, then there's a need for having a very tailored approach. A child might be a victim, has maybe been brought to the conflict zone, has been born on the conflict zone, But is that only a victim? Can a child also become a full actor, as we have seen in some of the terrorist attacks? So a risk assessment, including for females, as I just alluded to, some of the females, and there were not so many females, are known as the hardcore recruiters, but also can be simple victims. What about the men? Were they just involved in very minor activity, and have they been more traumatized than anybody else around them? And are also some victims without criminal record, without any terrorist intent? How do you have a good risk management? And of course, we need to think about prosecution, rehabilitation, reintegration, and also that aspect becomes quite complex, as we've seen that after screening and after evaluation, some of the returnees might land in the prison, might be prosecuted, and being confronted with the fact that even that is not giving us the guarantees for a brighter future for society, as we need de-radicalization programs in the prisons, which are very often highly surpopulated and understaffed, not having the right approaches in relation to rehabilitation, and not having the right reintegration, or in some countries being confronted with very short sentences and not having enough time or professionalism to get the rehabilitation and reintegration done in the right way. So yes, a lot of concerns, but that's exactly what we do: creating awareness, talking with the member states, and making the CT chain as strong as possible.
Excellent. And as we look at the reason foreign fighters are returning to their home countries, that's because of the dwindling war in Syria. ISIS has been defeated territorially. They still exist. They still pose a threat around the globe. But territorially in Syria and Iraq, they no longer control the territory they once did. As a leading expert in the field and a person who has access and completes the reports of assessments of the 193 member states, in your opinion, where do we need to look to next as the next theater of global terrorism?
Well, we have to look everywhere and be alert and vigilant at all times and in all the spots of the world. To start with, when my colleague Yusuf Rongov and myself presented the 8th Daesh-ISIL report to the Security Council, a report of the Secretary General, we insisted on that point. Yes, there was a defeat ISIL, territorial losses, excellent work of the military, but there is a but. We have seen and been informed that in spite of those territorial losses, ISIL still has a huge capacity to make misuse of ICT and social media, and are doing this, and hence are inspiring others who maybe never have traveled, including solo actors and lone wolves, to, in a very radicalized way, attack innocent people, crowds, as we have seen in recent years, which is adding an extra layer on our burdens. And secondly, their financial resources have not really been too much affected, and so they really are in a capability to get involved in large-scale terrorist attacks. And this is not it, because of course you have other terrorist organizations which are up and running, and in some parts of the world you have this very mysterious combination between terrorist groups, terrorist cells, armed groups, criminal groups. You have intercommunal disputes and frictions and solidarity which change overnight between those different groups. So yes, the scourge of terrorism is not yet over, and there are lots of reasons to continue this hard fight.
And as we continue to look, we see that not every country is able to put all the resources, the same amount of resources, into counterterrorism action. Each state obviously has its own issues domestically and individually, but they also have a finite amount of resources. As an expert in the field, where would you recommend governments, practitioners, direct the finite amount of resources they have? Because, for example, if we wanted to, in the United States, we can give an example, if they wanted to actually survey someone for 24 hours a day, it would take at least 15 officers, besides all the other financial resources that need to go into it. You'd need 15 people to be on one person round the clock. No country has the manpower or the resources to do something like that. So people need to make decisions. Where are they going to put the resources that they do have? Where would you recommend is one of the more important places that they direct that finite amount of resources that they do have?
Well, I would be absolutely happy if I would give you one answer which would fit all the bills, and this is exactly why we need those dialogues with 193 countries, because depending on the region, depending on the country in a specific region, the situation might be totally different. You have, of course, a big difference between the developing and the developed countries, and you have different needs and different priority setting in the country. So when we go assessing the country, we come back with recommendations, which we discuss in the Security Council, discuss with the country, and once a report with a recommendation is being finalized, we discuss it with the member state. And it's really meant to see, where are the gaps, where are the big wins of this country, the strong points of this country, and how can we also not only say what they need, but also bring back home their good practices, their efficient practices, and spread them to the rest of the world in order to level up the possibilities in other countries. So it's not only about going to a country and say, you need to do this and this and this. It's going to the country, discussing the whole range of measures, and see where there is a need for the country to step up its activity and to do it on their own accord, but also to say this is really a priority, this is really a gap, and we will, in bridging with OCT, the Office of Counterterrorism of the United Nations, see in what extent we can deliver technical assistance and capacity building. And that is, I think, where we bring in projects where we fill the gaps. And that is exactly the mechanism of the United Nations. Identifying the problems, which CTED is doing, making a diagnosis, very tailor-made, very targeted and very focused, and then see what has to be done with a priority in which country. And yes, you have absolutely a point. If we are going to surveil everybody, we will miss our goal. We have to focus on the right people, and hence the risk assessments are so important. I read, for instance, that the monitoring one person after release in prison in one country costs $7 million. So you can see indeed that having 100 people to follow in one country would cost an enormous amount of money, which we cannot afford. And yes, so we have to make choices. We have to make choices, but targeted choices.
Makes perfect sense to me. And one thing we know is that the terrorists continuously try to stay one step ahead of the game, looking for new vulnerabilities, new abilities to attack. And that's also on the counter-terrorist experts' mind all the time, is how do we get one step ahead of the terrorists? What are they planning next? How do we get into their heads to try to figure out what do they think? And as we look at that, what vulnerability keeps you up at night that you would say, this is a vulnerability that we need to focus on because it could be easily exploited in the next wave of terrorism?
Absolutely, and that's the inspiring part of this job. It never stops, and you have to follow the pace of the terrorists, and of course use all your creativity and inventivity. There are some concerns which already today are considered as a concern, like the massive use of ICT and social media for terrorist purposes. We know that they're used for recruitment and for financing and and for incitement of terrorists. But what about cyber hacking? What about more sophisticated ways of touching critical infrastructure? We were confronted with massive problems of non-protection of soft targets and critical infrastructure. We have seen the latest examples in Christchurch and Colombo, where soft targets were being chosen out for obvious reasons. Well, we have been working on this. How can we protect our soft targets? How can we protect our critical infrastructure? But what is if we're not being confronted with terrorists only using military rifles and explosive devices or knives or lorries, but using cyber attacks and hackings, then we are entering another scenario. So that is something we are working on, creating partnerships in a proactive way between the public and the private sector, and seeing how we can exchange information, experiences in advance. What about the artificial intelligence? I know that Dr. Boaz is one of the top experts in this field. He's on top of things, but that's also something that is keeping us awake. Everything is becoming smart, and it's meant to make this world become a greater world. Development also has a flip side. What if AI is being used for terrorist purposes? And what will happen when one day all the smart cars are going in a different direction and are causing a big problem in one city, for instance? This is just one example, but there are a multitude of examples to be given. Drones, the unmanned aircraft vehicles or systems. CTED has published a trend alert in the month of May, just creating awareness about the possible misuse of drones. Drones that can be used for disruptive reasons, for destructive reasons in crowded areas, against soft targets or against critical infrastructure. What should be done in that area? And we have already some ideas, but I advise to go to the website of CTED and to have a look at the trends alert. And then many others. Financing of terrorism, cash couriers were a big problem in the past and still are, Hawala system. But what about crowd funding? What about the use of virtual money?
Cryptocurrencies.
That's it, or the alternative remittance system. So yes, we have to think ahead of time. We say weapons of mass destruction, not a big deal so far, but if you make a combination between that and the possibilities offered by the internet and are very inventive, we from our end must also be very inventive and creative.
Yeah, I think we need to be just as creative and think outside the box, just as they do, to try to be inventive and more bombastic and more explosive, no pun intended, but with their actions and their theater, in essence, we also need to be one step ahead and think outside the box. This year is the ICT's 19th Annual World Summit on Counterterrorism. This year's conference is titled Terrorism 2020, Understand the Present, Prepare for the Future. So very interesting that we just spoke about what we did. What does that mean exactly to you? And as well, how can our audience that's coming to the summit, what could they expect from your highly anticipated keynote address?
I'll say come and see next month or in September, and I'm thrilled in participating again in this high-level CT conference. It's always good to know where you stand, where you're coming from, and then to have a look into the future. I think that it's good in this job to be active, reactive, rapidly reactive, but it's even better to be proactive. So we will have a chance with experts from around the world to look into the future and to see what indeed ICT might offer for terrorists and for us, what drones, what the AI, what weapons of mass destruction can pose as a problem, and to see what we can do about this together.
Excellent. We look forward to seeing you at the conference. Michele Coninsx, thank you so much for joining us. She's the Executive Director of the Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate at the Assistant Secretary General level. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us here in studio and giving us some wonderful insight and enlightening information about the counterterrorism world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Counter-Terrorism Today.